We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on all notifications because on March 10th...
Forget the rumors, because by January 31st, Nancy Guthrie's final normal hours may already have been captured in a way that fundamentally changes how investigators understand her disappearance. Before the garage timeline, before the pacemaker silence, before surveillance systems failed, Nancy Guthrie was reportedly recorded during what should have been one of the most ordinary moments of her life, a simple ride to family dinner. At approximately 5:32 p.m., Nancy left her Tucson home.
It was not the blood on the doorstep alone that changed the direction of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. It was not only the missing camera. It was not only the overnight silence. It was not only the fact that an elderly woman vanished from her own home in the middle of the night. What changed everything was the moment investigators appeared to stop treating the case like a random abduction and began treating it like a sequence. A sequence built around timing, access, familiarity, routine, vulnerability, and someone who may have understood Nancy Guthrie's life long before the night she disappeared. For weeks, the public looked at the case through one frightening image: a woman gone from her Catalina Foothills home, a quiet neighborhood shaken by something that felt almost impossible. Nancy was elderly. She lived alone. She had medical needs. She had family, routines, and a home where she should have been safe. Then, after returning from a family gathering, she vanished before morning. At first, many people imagined a stranger, a masked intruder, someone moving through the darkness, someone who saw an opportunity and took it. That explanation was terrifying, but it was also easier for the public to understand. A stranger is simple. A stranger comes from outside the story. A stranger allows people to believe the danger arrived suddenly, without history, without emotional connection, without anyone close to Nancy ever needing to ask impossible questions. But as investigators looked deeper, the stranger theory began to feel less complete. Because the crime did not seem chaotic. That is the detail that matters. Random crimes usually leave behind disorder, panic, improvisation, confusion, mistakes made because the offender does not know the environment. A random offender does not usually know the best time to approach. A random offender does not usually know the victim's vulnerabilities. A random offender does not usually understand the property well enough to move with confidence. But the person who came near Nancy Guthrie's home appeared to move with purpose. And purpose suggests preparation. That is when the case began to shift. Investigators were no longer only asking who could have attacked Nancy. They were asking who knew enough to do it in that way. Who knew her home? Who knew when she would be alone? Who knew her routine? Who knew whether she had help overnight? Who knew the camera system? Who knew the quietest window of time? Who knew she was vulnerable? Those questions changed the emotional temperature of the investigation. Because once you ask who knew, you are no longer only looking outward. You are also forced to look inward. Nancy Guthrie had spent the evening with family before returning home. By every ordinary measure, that should have been the safest kind of night. Dinner, conversation, familiar faces, a ride home, a garage closing, the end of a normal evening. But normal is exactly what makes this case so haunting. Because after that final routine, the timeline entered darkness. According to the storyline in the script, investigators became deeply focused on the sequence after Nancy returned home. The time she entered the residence, who was last with her, whether anyone remained near the property, whether lights were seen later, whether neighbors heard anything, and whether the known timeline matched the evidence that later emerged. That kind of reconstruction is not casual. Investigators do not obsess over minutes unless minutes matter. And in this case, the minutes mattered. The public may see only one large event: Nancy disappeared. But investigators see a chain of smaller events. Each link must be tested. Each statement must be compared. Each silence must be explained. If one part of the chain does not hold, the whole story changes. That is why the last confirmed contact became important. Not because being the last person with someone automatically makes a person guilty. It does not. Families bring elderly relatives home every day. Loved ones help at the door. Son-in-laws, daughters, sons, friends, and caregivers all become part of ordinary timelines without anything criminal behind it. But investigators do not look at one detail alone. They look at sequence. And in Nancy's case, the sequence became more disturbing the longer it was examined. She came home. The night went quiet. There was no immediate alarm. No overnight rescue. No interruption. No call that changed the course of the night. Then came the early morning hours, the hours where the real mystery lives. The pacemaker data became one of the most chilling pieces of the story because it introduced something stronger than memory. It introduced technology. Human memory can bend under fear, stress, grief, or pressure. But a medical device does not tell stories to protect anyone. It does not choose sides. It records a signal, a connection, a silence. And when Nancy's pacemaker monitoring stopped transmitting or lost connection, it suggested something deeply troubling. Nancy was no longer where she should have been. That moment narrowed the window. It took the case from uncertainty into a more specific frame. Something happened during the night. Something that moved Nancy away from the ordinary safety of her home. Something that broke the expected pattern of her life. And when investigators placed that signal beside the silence surrounding the house, the picture became darker. No meaningful overnight communication. No immediate intervention. No one showing up in time. No sign that Nancy was helped when she needed it most. Again, silence by itself proves nothing. Families do not monitor one another every second. People sleep. People miss calls. People assume everything is fine because most nights are fine. But context changes everything. Nancy was not just any person living alone. She was elderly. She had vulnerabilities. She depended on routine. She reportedly removed her hearing aids at night. She relied on medication. She did not have someone watching over her every hour. If someone knew all of that, then the overnight window was not random. It was usable. That is the disturbing possibility at the heart of this case. Nancy's vulnerability may not simply have been tragic. It may have been exploited. And if it was exploited, the question becomes, who understood it well enough to use it? The surveillance evidence deepened that question. A masked figure was reportedly seen approaching the residence during the early morning hours. But what mattered was not only the mask. Masks are obvious. Gloves are obvious. Dark clothing is obvious. Once investigators began treating Nancy Guthrie's disappearance as a sequence, every detail started to carry a different weight. The camera was no longer just a camera. The silence was no longer just silence. The missing overnight hours were no longer just a gap in the timeline. The property searches, the digital records, the reported financial questions, the possible reconnaissance, the movement of reporters, and the attention surrounding connected locations all began to feel like pieces of one larger picture. And that picture was becoming darker. Because if the person who came to Nancy's home knew the property, understood the timing, and recognized her vulnerabilities, then the crime was no longer just a violent interruption. It was planning. And planning changes everything. A spontaneous offender reacts to a moment. A planned offender builds one. That is the difference investigators appeared to be studying. The person who approached Nancy Guthrie's residence reportedly did not behave like someone stumbling through an unfamiliar place. The movement seemed controlled. The camera disruption seemed intentional. The timing seemed too precise to ignore. And when investigators began looking at the broader environment around Nancy's life, the question was no longer simply who could have done this. It became who had prepared for it. That is where the reported camera removal became so important. A doorbell camera is not just a device. In a case like this, it is a witness. It watches the entrance. It records movement. It captures visitors, strangers, delivery workers, family members, and anyone else who comes close enough to the front door. For someone planning a crime, that camera is a problem. And according to the storyline in the script, the individual who approached Nancy's residence appeared to act directly against that camera, physically interfering with it during the early morning hours. That kind of act is not random. It suggests the person knew the camera existed. It suggests the person understood that the doorway was being watched. It suggests the person had already thought about visibility. And most importantly, it suggests the person was not only focused on reaching Nancy. They were focused on controlling what the evidence would show afterward. That is a very different kind of offender. Someone acting in panic may run. Someone acting impulsively may leave obvious mistakes. But someone who disables or removes a camera is thinking about the investigation before the investigation has even started. That detail would have mattered to federal agents, because it suggests pre-event awareness. And once investigators begin asking what the offender knew before the crime, the case moves into a more complicated stage. How did they know the camera was there? Had they seen it before? Had they been to the home before? Had they searched the property online? Had they studied the layout? Had they watched the home? Had someone told them what to expect? These questions are not dramatic decoration. They are the center of the investigation, because knowledge has a source. Some knowledge comes from personal familiarity. Some comes from repeated visits. Some comes from digital research. Some comes from surveillance. Some comes from another person. Investigators had to determine which kind of knowledge this offender had. And that is why the reported digital searches became such an explosive part of the public conversation. According to the script, reports later discussed possible digital activity involving searches connected to Nancy Guthrie's address before the disappearance. Those reported searches became important because they suggested the possibility of reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is one of the most chilling words in a case like this. It means the crime may not have started at the door. It may have started weeks or months earlier. It may have started with someone looking at images, studying the property, checking the layout, learning the approach, understanding the angles, looking for blind spots, seeing where a person could enter and leave. If that is true, then the night Nancy vanished was not the beginning of the danger. It was the final stage of it. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of everything. The final dinner becomes heavier. The goodbye becomes heavier. The ride home becomes heavier. The garage closing becomes heavier. The silence afterward becomes almost unbearable. Because if planning had been happening before that night, then Nancy may have been in danger while still living normally. She may have been going through the ordinary rhythms of life while someone else was quietly building a plan around her. That is what makes this case so disturbing. The violence is frightening. But the preparation is colder. Preparation means time. It means thought. It means the offender had chances to stop and did not. It means the person responsible may have studied an elderly woman's life, her vulnerabilities, her routines, and her home, then waited for the moment when she would be most exposed. That is why investigators could not treat the case like a random break-in. Randomness did not explain enough. The camera interference suggested awareness. The timing suggested patience. The movement suggested familiarity. The vulnerability window suggested information. And then came another possibility that deepened the suspicion around planning: signal disruption. According to the script, analysts and investigators reportedly discussed whether specialized equipment may have been used to interfere with wireless systems around the residence. That possibility matters because signal disruption is not ordinary criminal behavior. Most impulsive offenders do not carry jamming equipment. Most random intruders do not understand wireless systems well enough to plan around them. If a person used or considered using something like that, it would suggest research, preparation, and knowledge that the home depended on connected devices. Again, this remains a reported theory, not a proven conclusion. But as an investigative possibility, it fits into the larger question. Was this crime built around technology? The camera, the pacemaker monitor, the signal, the silence, the missing footage, the possible disruption. If technology became part of the crime, then investigators had to examine not only who had physical access to Nancy, but who understood the systems around her. Who knew about the camera? Who knew where it was placed? Who knew what it recorded? Who knew whether the home had weak spots? By the time the Nancy Guthrie investigation reached its third major phase, the emotional center of the case had changed again. At first, the public had focused on the disappearance itself. Then the attention shifted toward planning, camera disruption, possible reconnaissance, and the question of who may have known enough about Nancy's life to exploit her most vulnerable hours. But now, the case was moving into something even more dangerous. Behavior. Because experienced investigators understand that major crimes are not only solved by what happens during the crime. They are often solved by what happens before it and after it. The preparation before. The silence during. The behavior after. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the behavior surrounding the disappearance began to matter almost as much as the physical evidence itself. Who changed after Nancy vanished? Who became unusually quiet? Who became unusually controlled? Who focused on practical matters too quickly? Who seemed more concerned with the story than with uncertainty? Who avoided emotional unpredictability? Who acted like someone trying to manage perception instead of living through shock? None of those things prove guilt by themselves. That has to be said clearly. People respond to trauma in different ways. Some people cry. Some people go numb. Some become organized. Some focus on tasks because tasks are the only thing keeping them from falling apart. Some sound calm because shock has frozen them. Investigators know this, which is why behavior alone is never enough. But behavior becomes important when it lines up with evidence. And that is what made this phase of the Nancy Guthrie investigation feel so tense. The question was no longer simply whether someone had harmed Nancy. The question was whether the person responsible had been hiding inside the normal behavior of everyday life before the crime, and then trying to manage the aftermath once Nancy was gone. That possibility changed everything. Because if the disappearance was planned, then the crime did not begin when the masked figure approached the house. It began earlier. Maybe days earlier. Maybe weeks earlier. Maybe months earlier. It may have begun with someone noticing Nancy's routine. Someone learning when she was alone. Someone understanding how the property worked. Someone paying attention to the cameras. Someone knowing the quietest hours of the night. Someone understanding that once Nancy removed her hearing aids, she may not hear movement around the home. Someone understanding that no overnight caregiver would interrupt. That is why investigators reportedly became so focused on the idea of escalation. Not just a single violent act. A sequence. A build-up. A plan forming quietly before anyone realized Nancy was in danger. The source script describes this idea clearly. The concern that Nancy's disappearance may have been the final stage of a sequence involving image searches, possible financial strain, operational knowledge, vulnerability awareness, and familiarity with her routines. That is what makes the case so psychologically disturbing. It is not only the possibility of violence. It is the possibility of precision. Because precision suggests patience. Precision suggests thought. Precision suggests the offender may have known exactly how much time existed before anyone would notice something was wrong. That kind of confidence does not usually come from luck. It comes from information. And information has a source. That is the question investigators could not let go. Where did the information come from? Was it learned through personal familiarity? Was it learned through repeated visits? Was it learned through online searches? Was it learned by watching the home? Was it learned from someone else? Was it learned because the person responsible was already close enough to Nancy's world to know things a stranger would have needed time to discover? That is why familiarity remained the darkest thread in the case. A stranger can be terrifying, but a stranger has to guess. Someone familiar does not have to guess. Someone familiar may already know the victim's habits, the layout of the home, the weak points in the security, the medical limitations, the family schedule, and the period of time when help is least likely to arrive. That is what investigators appeared to be studying. Not just who had motive, but who had enough knowledge to act with confidence. And once that kind of confidence becomes visible, investigators start looking at everything differently. The final dinner is no longer just dinner. The ride home is no longer just a ride home. The overnight silence is no longer just a gap. The camera disruption is no longer just a technical event. The emergency call is no longer just a record of panic. The property activity after the disappearance is no longer just family movement. Everything becomes part of a pattern that has to be tested. This is where the emergency call became one of the most talked about pieces of the case. According to the source material, the full recording was reportedly withheld from public release, and analysts publicly discussing the investigation suggested that the withholding itself may have been meaningful. Now, that does not automatically mean the call contains something suspicious. Emergency recordings can be withheld for many legitimate reasons. They can contain private medical information, investigative details, emotional family material, or details law enforcement does not want to expose while a case is active. But in a high-profile case where every other piece of evidence appears to be tightly protected, the public naturally begins to ask why. Why hold back the call? What does it reveal? Does it contain a timeline? Does it contain statements investigators later compared against evidence? Does it show when concern became official? Does it capture the first version of what people believed happened? Does it include something that could become important in court? Nobody outside the investigation can answer those questions with certainty. But the fact that people are asking them shows how much the case has changed. The public no longer sees silence as empty. They see it as strategy. Every withheld recording feels protected. Every delayed release feels intentional. Every forensic update feels like another piece being placed into position. And that is when a case begins to feel prosecutorial. Not just investigative. Prosecutorial. A prosecution is not built from emotion. It is not built from public suspicion. It is not built from people saying they feel someone is guilty.